For the last few years, people have been frantically asking themselves,
is Islam a religion of peace?
Are Islam and democracy compatible?
It's a question that divides many people, and indeed the outcome could have grave repercussions for the Western world, as Islam seeks to migrate to progressive democratic nations. Given its importance, I've decided to examine this question myself, and to answer it fully, I'm going to look at it from 5 different perspectives, using the following 5 questions. The questions are: 1. Did Islam expand peacefully? 2. Was the Prophet a peaceful person? 3. Does the teachings of Islam contain a lot of hate speech? 4. Does it live in peace with people who do not follow its beliefs? 5. Are the people who follow the ideology of Islam peaceful? Okay, so the first question then, did Islam expand peacefully? Okay, so most of us know that Islam was founded by a man called Muhammad. It was believed to have been born in 571 and died in 632, which gives him an approximate lifespan of 61 years. Muhammad first started to teach Islam in Mecca at around the age of 40, but he was expelled and had to flee to Medina. It was whilst in Medina he raised his follower base to around 1500 people, and it's at this stage he started to expand his ideology through military conquests. Looking at the map, we can see the expansion of Islam over a 128-year period. The first phase of the expansion was the conquest of what we now call Arabia, and it was personally overseen by Muhammad as general and took as little as 10 years to complete. Muhammad died in 632, at which stage a new caliph was elected from his closest circle, and they continued in the military tradition of expansion. Over a 29-year period, they conquered what we now know as Egypt, Syria, Armenia, Persia, and Jerusalem. In 661, the first of the Umayyad caliphs was elected. From now on, rulership of the Islamic Empire would be from direct descendants of this clan. Over the next 89 years, various caliphs took over Afghanistan, Tunisia, Morocco, and then ventured into much of Spain and Portugal. From this then we can conclude that Islam spread by the sword, not by rational arguments, not through persuasion, and therefore we cannot say that Islam was spread using peaceful methods. Question number 2 then, was Muhammad a peaceful person? I think it is fair to say that if someone came to you and suggested they had found the ultimate truths to life, you would expect them to embody some higher principles. The Quran, or the teachings of Muhammad, can be divided into 2 sections. When he decided to become a prophet, there was already well-established religions in the area he was living. In order to become established, he knew only too well he needed to be accepted by those already established communities, and hence much of his teachings in the early stages was peace and goodwill to all men. For example, he recognized the Jewish Torah and the Christian Bible as being divine texts, and even accepted much of its teachings as the revelations of God. He also recognized Moses and Jesus as being prophets sent by God. Later, however, as he begins to embark on military campaigns to conquer Arabia, and as he becomes more successful, he begins to alter his opinion on different religions. This is something we can examine in more detail later. For now, I want to examine the character of the man. One of the most violent acts recorded was the gratuitous slaughter of 800 Quraysh Jews by Muhammad in 627 AD. At the time, the chief of the Quraysh Jews was put in an impossible position. They were being pressured by the Meccans to send an army to help defeat Muhammad, and Muhammad was pressurizing them to supply digging tools to help build a trench and to provide troops to help defeat the Meccans. The chief decided to remain neutral, although they did send the tools as requested. After Muhammad won the battle, he decided to extract his vengeance by killing 800 Jewish men over the age of 12 years old. It is documented that he sat with his now infamous child bride Aisha, watching the executions, which took a full day to complete. The remaining Jewish women and children were sold into slavery. The young women in particular were forced into sex slavery, of which Muhammad was allowed to take his pick. This is documented in Ishaq 693, where it says, "There was one last share of the spoils for Muhammad. The most beautiful Jewess became his slave for pleasure." I'm sure you would agree that this is hardly the act of a spiritually enlightened person, but more mimics that of a brutal dictator. This is particularly concerning when you consider that the religious leader should embody the ideal of perfection and should be someone who the followers should try and mimic. Many people point out that other religions have hate speech in their holy books, and yet they choose not to act upon it. This, I can't help but feel, is highly relevant in a time when we are asking why Islam appears to be so much more violent than other religions. Consider this for a moment. Should a Christian or Buddhist be asked to commit an atrocity in the name of their religion, they would be forced to look at their prophet and ask, in both instances, what would Jesus have done, or what would Buddha have done in that circumstance? And in both cases, they were documented as being meek, mild, and incapable of violence. But should Muslims encounter violent passages within the Quran or the Hadith and ask themselves what would Muhammad done in this situation, we get a very different story, for Muhammad was capable of great acts of violence, whereas the other religious leaders act as a kind of moral voice of conscience. Okay then, question number 3. Does Islam contain a lot of hate speech? Okay, we know that Muslims are going to be taught to respect other Muslims. So when I use the term hate speech, I really mean how they view non-believers and specifically how they are taught to treat non-believers. Before we begin, it is worth pointing out that the Quran constitutes only 14% of the total teachings of Islam. In fact, surprisingly, most of the teachings in Islam is about Muhammad and the way he lived his life. Remember, Muhammad was not the ideal role model. There are in fact 4 books, the 4 pillars of Islam as they are called. The first one we know is the Quran, and this is considered to be the literal interpretation of God's will. Then you have the Hadith, which is a written account of Muhammad's deeds. The Sirah is considered his autobiography, and the Sunnah is the basis of much of their legal system. Again, this is taken from the deeds of Muhammad. It is worth pointing out that the Quran was written over 100 years after Muhammad's death. Therefore, a lot that has been documented is contentious and open to question. So the first book I'm going to examine is the Quran. Now, anybody that has read the Quran will find it quite contradictory. You will indeed find passages encouraging tolerance, but you will also find many passages encouraging intolerance towards non-believers. The reason for this, remember, is that when he started out, he needed to fit in with the already established religions in the area. But later, as he grew in confidence, he began to change his opinion about these religions. Much of what we may consider to be hate speech is found in the latter half of the Quran. It's also relevant at this stage to point out that in the Quran itself, it orders the reader to give more prominence to the latter stages of the Quran. Hence, much of the tolerant messages are overridden by the latter parts of the book. Nevertheless, here is an assortment of passages taken from the Quran. First passage: when you meet the unbelievers, smite their necks. Second passage: Oh, you who believe, fight those other disbelievers who are close to you and let them find harshness in you. Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh to the unbelievers. Passage number 4 now. They wish that you would reject faith, as they have rejected faith, unless that you would all be equal. So don't take protectors from them unless they emigrate in the way of Allah. But if they turn back, then seize them and kill them wherever you find them. So next up then I'll be quoting from the hadith, which just as a reminder is a record of Muhammad's deeds as recorded by his closest circle. So the first passage says, "It has been narrated by Umar that he heard the Messenger of Allah say, 'I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and will not leave any but Muslim.'" Now this is advocating a form of ethnic cleansing. It would be similar to modern day Europeans saying that they would rid the European continent of all Muslims, leaving only Christians. The second passage was narrated by someone called Abdullah. It says that Muhammad said to him, "The blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah and that I am his messenger cannot be shed except in 3 cases. Increases equality in punishment, for murder for example. A married person who commits illegal sexual intercourse, and the one who reverts from Islam, an apostate, and leaves the Muslims." This passage is where Muslims get the law of apostasy from. It clearly shows that Muhammad gives permission for fellow Muslims to kill those who try and leave the religion. And in many Muslim countries, this is carried out to the letter, showing that Muslims are willing to follow in the path of Muhammad rather than question their book on grounds of fairness. And last but not least, I have this little gem. There's a record of a conversation between Amir Umayyah and Muhammad. Muhammad sent Amir to murder Muhammad's enemy, Abu Safan. However, their assassination attempt failed. As he returned home, he met a one-eyed shepherd. The shepherd and the Muslim man both identified themselves as members of the same Arab clan. Prior to going to sleep, the shepherd said that he would never become a Muslim. Umayyah waited for the shepherd to fall asleep, and thereafter, as soon as the Badu was asleep and snoring, I got up and killed him in a more horrible way than any man has been killed. I put the end of my bow in his sound eye, then I bore down on it until I forced it out at the back of his neck. Umayyah returned, spoke with Muhammad. He relates, he, Muhammad, asked my news, and when I told him what had happened, he blessed me. I mean, this is quite a remarkable story. This is an innocent man who didn't give insult or injury to any member of his party, and yet he was killed in the most horrendous fashion. And more remarkably, when this man went back to Muhammad, he blessed him, condoning the action. What's more remarkable is that Muhammad is held up as the ideal man that Muslims are said to emulate. We wonder in the West why Islam and violence seem to have some kind of connection, but here we see it. Their own prophet Muhammad was a violent man, and they, as followers of this religion, are encouraged to emulate his behaviour to further the cause of Islam. It is also important to recognise that 84% of Islamic teaching is about following in the footsteps of Muhammad. Question number 4 now. Does Islam live in peace with people who do not follow its beliefs? So we've seen from question 1 that Muhammad was able to conquer much of the Arabian Peninsula within 10 years, but then after his death they continued to expand, and I want to look now at how they coexisted with the people and the lands they occupied. Now we know that Muslims recognized Jews and Christians as being people of the book, but this does not mean to say they had equal status. For example, Jews and Christians were in some cases allowed to operate their own law courts, but Muslims only recognized a Sharia law court. And indeed, Jews and Christians were not allowed to testify in a Sharia law court, which effectively means that a Muslim could do pretty much whatever they wanted to you, and you didn't have any legal right to object. So in essence, if they wanted to commit an act of rape against a non-Muslim, or if they wanted to steal a non-Muslim's possessions, there is very little you can do about this, because you can't take them into their own law courts, and they won't recognise your law courts. To add insult to injury, non-Muslims had to pay a special tax called a jizya tax, which is still practiced in some Muslim countries today. We know from history that when people cannot be held to account, tyranny will always be found, and so it is that many non-Muslims were compelled to convert to Islam in order to escape this oppressive regime. Spare a thought also for the many non-Muslims or Christians who had no protection whatsoever and were despised. Muslims are quick to look to this era and promote this multicultural environment, but the facts of the matter are that non-Muslims faced unfair and brutal treatment until they decided to convert to Islam. So, last question now. Are the people who follow the ideology of Islam peaceful? Okay, I'm not going to apologise for moving straight into terrorism. For although I recognise that not all Muslims are terrorists, most terrorists now in the world are Muslim. Okay, I'm going to start with the European perspective. I believe this map was taken from 2017 and it shows the intensity of terror attacks within Europe, and most of the terror attacks were Islamic in origin. We can see from this map that the major terrorist hotspots were Britain, Northern Ireland, France, Germany and Belgium. However, when we look at it using this map, we can see a connection. It basically shows that the greater percentage of Muslims living in your country, the greater the threat of a terror attack. You notice with interest that some of the Eastern Bloc countries like Poland and Hungary had little or no terrorist activities, and that's because they do not allow Muslim immigration. Looking at this from a European perspective, we can certainly say we've had our problems. However, looking at the top 10 countries in the world that's known for terrorism, we see that 8 out of 10 of them are majority Muslim, where 2 of them are a mix of Muslim or another faith. Almost all of the attacks, 98%, occurred outside the US and Western Europe, despite these dominating the news cycle. When I researched why this was, I unearthed something quite disturbing. It turns out that ISIS and other terrorists who attack Muslims don't consider them to be true Muslims. And of course, one of the big problems with Islam is that nobody has control of it. They don't have a pope or central body, they're just a set of books, and these books are open to interpretation. ISIS are literalists, and they try and emulate the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. They do not view moderate Muslims as being true Muslims. So even in Muslim majority countries, they are still heavily affected by terrorism, which is quite concerning. If Islam can't peacefully coexist with fellow Muslims, then how can it ever peacefully coexist in the West? In conclusion then, we can say that Islam spread quite violently at the hand of the sword, that when they occupied these provinces, they did not give the people equal rights. They treated them as second-class citizens until they converted to Islam. Muhammad himself was a very violent person, and I find this quite odd because I don't know of any other spiritual leader that portrays himself in quite this manner. It is particularly concerning when you realise that people are encouraged to emulate their prophet, and also note that 86% of Islamic teachings is about living in the footsteps of Muhammad. Looking at just a handful of passages from the Quran and the Hadith, we can see that Islam encourages intolerance towards non-believers, and indeed there are many passages that encourage active violence against non-believers. Indeed, we can see that Muhammad verbally praises people who kill non-believers in his name. More concerning for me is when you look at how Muslims coexist together. When you find out that the most terrorist active countries are those with the majority of Muslim population, and then also look in Europe and see that countries with the highest density of Muslims are the ones where there's the highest terrorist alert, and ones where terrorist activities are taking place quite frequently. Although it is always fair to note that the majority of Muslims will not be involved in such activities. However, alarmingly, it shows that the greater percentage of Muslims living in your country, the greater number of terrorist attacks, which means one doesn't exist without the other. So can we now use this to answer our question, is Islam a religion of peace? Well, on the surface it would appear not. However, I suppose, like all books and like all religions, it is open to interpretation. A moderate Muslim, for me anyhow, would be somebody that used Islam as a kind of very loose framework on which to build their life. The problem is, however, Islam actually means to submit, and that means you are supposed to take the teachings literally and not try and interpret it yourself. And indeed we can see the so-called moderates live in fear of attacks and persecution from the radicals as much as anyone else. And it's no wonder then that the moderates never speak out against any aspect of Islam. The apologists for Islam will always point out that the majority of Muslims seem to live in peace, but for me this is highly irrelevant, for it is the radical element or the minority that exert the most control over society. Indeed, moderate Muslims will never be able to speak out against them. Going forward then, we need to take this to the logical conclusion that wherever there are Muslims there will be radicals, and the greater the number of Muslims living in your country, so there will be a greater number of radicals. You cannot have one without the other. Looking at the map of Eastern Europe, you can already see that the Eastern Bloc does not encounter these radical elements because they have zero Muslim population. It seems to me the West has some very difficult decisions to make going forward regarding Islam. However, for now we can answer the question, is Islam a religion of peace? There is no logical way you can say it is. For even if you take into account the many peaceful Muslims, the fact is, the teachings of Islam and its prophet were far from peaceful. If you like this and you would like to see more content in the future, please hit the subscribe button, and I look forward to reading your comments below. Take care.